It's important to keep in mind that these observations were true before COVID, are still true during COVID. Some of them have happened during COVID, and quite frankly, most of them, unless we do something about it, will continue even post-COVID. So the first one is the fact that we've had an economy where inequality has increased. There's been tremendous wage stagnation. And quite frankly, the labor markets and the job markets are very polarized. Let me show that a little bit. If you look at wealth inequality has actually soared in the last 10, 20 years. And it's particularly acute for Blacks and African Americans. And I'll come to that when we have our conversation. But at the same time, wage growth has also slowed down. And we have this kind of phenomenal, interesting observation about polarized labor markets, where those at the top are seeing economic growth, they're seeing wage growth, they're seeing wealth growth. Those in the middle especially are particularly squeezed. And then those at the bottom, quite frankly, things haven't moved very much. So this first point about inequality is important. The second important point is the fact that our economy is very uneven depending on where you live. So if you look across down, never mind states or even the coast, if you go down to the county level, the counties in America look very different. And those local economies are very different. So if you're thinking about opportunities, about jobs, this picture's changed quite a bit. I'll show you a good example here. If you look back to the Great Recession of 2008, and we look at even just the job recovery that happened from that, and we've now looked at all roughly 3,149 counties that make up America. And if you kind of group those counties, depending on their economic characteristics, you very quickly see that we've had these counties that you might label growth hubs, where the job growth has been tremendous. And then you've got the mega cities that have done well, but you've got parts of America or counties that we call Dia Americana or even distressed America, where quite frankly, the recovery even in job growth hasn't really happened. We already know that something like 60% of the net job growth happened in about 25 metro areas, where maybe 40% of the population lives. But we also know that something like the places where nearly 80 million Americans live basically have seen very little, if any, job growth. In fact, some of them have actually seen negative job growth. So this concentration and the differences by geography, I think, are very, very important. The third point I'd point out is the fact that even with all these challenges affecting everybody, we have these incredible persistent gender and racial disparities when it comes to jobs, wages, and quite frankly, access to opportunities. And you can look at any of the communities, but I'm just going to focus on, for example, if you look at the Black community and Black workers, we know that there's a big geographic mismatch, for example, between where the Black workers are, where the Black labor force is, and where the opportunities are. We know that something like 60% of the Black labor force lives in the South, versus something like a third or 33% of the rest of the workers who work in the private sector who are elsewhere, quite frankly, where the opportunities are. We also know that something like less than 1 in 10 Black workers are located in cities and counties with high job growth. So these kind of geographic disparities tend to impact some communities, especially the Black community, more than most. You can also look at the...
James, I know you have 10 points, and I don't want to interrupt you. I think just the stat you just put up, that only 1 out of 10 Black people live in an area with high job growth, was something I think that caught a lot of people's ears. I know it caught mine. Why is that? Why are only less than 10% of us living in a place where our prospects to see high job growth are high?
Well, part of it is history. The other part is also the fact that, in fact, some of those communities down at the county level haven't seen the kind of investments, both the public investments or the private sector investments in those communities that tend to lead to job growth. So the businesses have not been located there, economic activities have not been located there. And so those places are almost like job deserts, if you like. And that's where most people live. And that's actually quite a stunning fact when we looked at that down at the county level. Now, there's clearly things that can be done about that, such as investment, both by the private sector, by businesses, but also, quite frankly, public investment in schools and education. So that was quite a striking observation. But let me push ahead for a second. When you also look at, for example, representation by job category, I think you'll see that, for example, there's some job categories, and these are job categories in the chart here, where Black people are overrepresented, but they also happen to be job categories that have the lowest wages, for example. So in fact, we know that something like 43% of Black workers are in occupations that earn less than $30,000 annually versus 28% for everybody else. So there's an overrepresentation in low-wage occupations. We also know that roughly half of all the Black workers in the private sector are actually basically in three sectors. They're in healthcare, retail, and accommodation and food service. But look at the bottom of this chart. You'll see that there's a significant underrepresentation in many occupations that pay very well. And this is just a subset of those. So this is one of the persistent issues that we have, just to illustrate how these issues affect Black workers the most. Let me make a couple other points. One of the things that's changed about work generally is that we now have many more varieties of work in addition to traditional kind of full-time jobs. We now have gig work, contingent work, all kinds of other kinds of work. This, on the one hand, creates opportunities and some needed flexibility, quite frankly. But at the same time, it also comes with some huge challenges. I don't know if people realize that something like 60 million workers, 60 million people in the US are involved in these kind of independent gig economy jobs, either for their, as the primary source of income or as a secondary source of income. That's a lot of people who don't have benefits, who don't have clear career pathways, who have incomes that are very fragile because how much you earn and what you earn can vary from moment to moment, month to month. But these varieties of work, I think, are an important factor that has changed. And then, of course, we've got, quite frankly, a growing phenomenon of working poverty in America. I mean, I was stunned in our research to realize that something like 40 million Americans who work are basically living in near poverty levels because they don't earn enough. And that also is a group that's disproportionately Black and African American, which is quite stunning. Then, of course, our economy itself has been shifting. I mean, when you look around the country, suddenly realize that, we've reduced the amount of investments that go into communities, into training, into education, and that's both the public sector, but also the private sector in terms of investments. We know that most of the jobs that are growing tended to be the lower wage jobs. And so you have all these kind of structural things that are affecting our economy. Our productivity goes up, but our wages don't go up. So those are some structural shifts that have been happening for the last 20 years. And then, of course, you've got the technology-related changes. Here, I think I should point out that the impact of these is not just a jobless future. I think that's a wrong way to think about it. All the research we've done, quite frankly, many others have done, basically show that what AI and automation are going to do to work is, yes, we will have some jobs lost, but we're also going to have some new jobs grow, but we're going to have many more jobs changed. So the real implication of that is the need to address the skilling, the worker transitions, and quite frankly, all the other adverse effects that we're going to need to navigate as we make that transition. And here I'll emphasize again that if you look at the most jobs that are at risk or the ones that are changing the most, you find that Black and African American workers are disproportionately represented in those jobs, as are women. So that's why this becomes a very important issue to think about as we look forward.
James, I don't mean to interrupt you again. Great point there. So I think one question that is catching my ear, how do we prepare for these jobs of the future, and why are people of color and women excluded from the preparation of these jobs of the future?
Well, I think a big part of the preparation for the future has to do with reskilling. And I think the reskilling question is important as some jobs decline, but also as jobs changed. And quite often, most of our educational institutions are not as well prepared for that. And in fact, and many of the examples we have of reskilling that are going on it's happening at too small a scale. So the question is, how do we take all the great small examples of reskilling to where we do reskilling at scale? That's the real challenge. And often folks are not involved in those conversations, they're not involved in shaping those programs for reskilling. And often the reskilling isn't happening in the places, back to the geography point, isn't happening in the places where it needs to happen. That's part of the challenge. And one of the things that's interesting to this idea that some jobs will grow and some jobs will decline. We know, for example, as this chart shows, these are some of the jobs at the top are the ones that will grow, but we know a lot of them are going to decline. And if you look at the ones at the bottom of this picture, they tend to disproportionately have low-income workers in them. They tend to disproportionately also have people of color working in those jobs. And that's why all these issues around reskilling, retraining need to focus in people who are in those occupations at the bottom of this picture. And it needs to happen at scale. The scale point is important because look at that number to the right. If you look at the kind of job shifts we're going to see by 2030, we're talking in the tens of millions of jobs. So reskilling 5 people is great, but we need to skill a heck of a lot more people. That's why this reskilling at scale is a really, really important point. Let me point to some other things that we're now experiencing in this moment. One of the things, and this is the world that most employers and workers are living in right now, but this has been going on for some time. We have this extraordinary kind of supply-demand mismatches where, some people feel like they can't find enough workers. Some people say they can't find jobs. Some companies say we have all these open recs, we can't fill them. In fact, right now, if you pay attention to what companies are saying, everybody's experiencing these tight labor markets for some people and for some kind of work, whereas in some kind of work in some other places, that's not the case. So the question is, how do we deal with these supply-demand mismatches or skill mismatches or locational mismatches? How do we connect people to work? How do we connect people to the training that they need to access the jobs that seem to be available? This is a very persistent issue that's been around for the last decade or more and is particularly acute in this moment. Then we have COVID, right? So COVID happens, and in the first case, it makes all the points I just made 1 through 8 even worse in some ways. But it also has added a few new twists because now, we've seen e-commerce accelerate, so home delivery and sort of home consumption, as well as remote work and hybrid work. But the thing that we often forget with remote and hybrid work is that if you look across the economy, in terms of the different jobs, only about 1/3 of the people can work from home. Everybody else typically has to show up somewhere. So if you work in a restaurant or if you work in a retail job, you actually have to show up somewhere. And sometimes I think, most of us who are able to work remotely talk about it as if everybody can work remotely. It's really only about 1/3 of workers who can actually do the job. Everybody else has to show up somewhere. So we have to think about the effects of that on particularly low-income workers, and also in particularly in respect to Black and African-American workers who disproportionately are in the occupations where they have to show up for work in order to do their jobs.
James, we're almost out of time. I want to ask just a couple more quick questions before we run out of time. I know you have a 10th point. So looking at these 10 points, we're seeing that it's definitely a very nuanced path forward for people of color and women, according to your data. What is the economic opportunity for creating a more inclusive economy for people of color, Black Americans, and women?
Well, the economic opportunity is huge in the following sense. Imagine, so if we had, wage parity, for example, that's an economic opportunity that we've analyzed to the tune of $220 billion of additional income and wages that would flow back into the economy. If we change the picture, for example, for how African Americans and Black workers can access jobs, can consume products, that's also an enormous opportunity. So the opportunities are huge, both in ways that help the economy, help Black and African American workers and households, and help everybody. The question is, how do we make sure it actually happens? How do we do the reskilling? How do we make it easy for people to access opportunities? How do we encourage companies to invest in communities? How do we encourage, for example, the public, our governments and state and local to invest in the educational skills and the places and schools to prepare people for work. Those are the questions to solve for, but it's not a question of the opportunity, not just for African Americans, but quite frankly, for the economy as a whole. The economy benefits when African Americans and other people of color and women and workers are involved in the economy. It's good for everybody.
James, unfortunately, we have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much for your insight and your time. James Manyika from the McKinsey Institute, some great data about the future of work, people of color and women. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.